Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone.
Buenos días a todos. Espero que estén todos emocionados acerca de este día final de este evento. Ahora nos gustaría comenzar con el primer de dos emocionantes paneles de hoy. Yo soy Ashin Ansumi, trabajo con la Iniciativa Global para Derechos Culturales Sociales y me emociona presentar el primer panel del día. Y comenzamos con un panel de alternativas feministas y servicios transformadores. Camila Miranda, Fundación 21.
And the panelists will be Aura
Gabriela Morciño,
Alliance for Tax Justice. Next, we'll have, absolutely, Liz Nelson. She's the Director for Tax Justice and Human Rights at the Tax Justice Network. They'll be joined by Magdalena Sepulveda. She's the Executive Director of the Global Initiative for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the former UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Extreme Poverty. The next speaker will be Rosa Pavanelli, the General Secretary of Public Services International. And finally, Wangari Kinoti, the Global Lead for Women's Rights and Feminist Alternatives at ActionAid International. Welcome them all. Thank you.
Estamos acá. Hola. Bueno, darles la bienvenida a
Welcome, welcome all of you. In the last day of our conference, Our Future is Public, we have a very interesting panel that looks for the feminist alternatives and the public services of gender. And for that, we are going to tackle different areas of the global crisis that we are experiencing, and the pandemic has left that in evidence, how this global crisis, the care is suffering that is very determined by the gender, and how do we take that as a role in the public area, and how especially the public services are they affected also by this sexual division of the work in the context of this Congress that gathers us today. How can we tackle things from different perspectives in the finance area, from the public and intersection of this dilemma? So, not to get in detail in this introduction, given that our panelists are going to tell us about different aspects, we're going to start from a first moment of exposure and dialogue, and then we're going to open the floor to this discussion to all of you that are here with us today. So, I wish you a very good day. And in first place, I would like to start with Magdalena Sepúlveda. She's an executive director of the Global Initiatives for the Economic, Cultural, and Social Rights. And Magdalena, please, it would be great if you can help us making a link between the manifest of the public services and the manifest of the roles, the public services, and the construction of the social organization of care. So thank you very much, Magdalena. It is a pleasure to get to this last day of this conference to make the link of the manifest of the public services and human rights and gender. I have to, in fact, to give a sort of context for what's going on. As you have mentioned, the pandemics of the COVID manifested the care, the lack of care, and the privatization of the public services that have had a huge impact and have subtracted the possibility to people to have a dignified life. But more than anything, we have made evident that the governments that do not prioritize the gender and the rights of women in the public policies. This is so because women, as the gender identities or the gender that is that does not agree, in fact, doesn't let us be in the decision taking table. And let us put this in context. Before the pandemics, the estimations and all the considerations about that said that the women they dedicate 4.7 hours of work, non-paid work, compared to the 4.7 of men. So this is not a complaint. I mean, this is a complaint, but it's important because we are taking into account these gaps on gender. And when we have considered to make these type of considerations for what this work means in terms of care, this work and the economic considerations, they get and they fluctuate in a 10 and a 50% of the GDP. And in spite of the importance and the impact that women have in the economy, it is invisible to the public policy. So from the beginning of the pandemics, we made evident that we had a differentiated impact, and women, they were having a negative impact out of proportion. But it's evident as well that not all the women they have the same level of impact. And women of indigenous people and women, the black women from the global south, are the ones that fill in the voids of care. So this is also accentuated because we see women many times that are left aside in intersectional situations. So this affects women, not all women in the same manner, but this also led us to has led us to a very important division. Another thing that is important is the link with human rights. This is a matter of human rights. The distribution of the loads of the tasks that are based in the discriminations and the bias of gender and the roles of gender, it has a huge impact in the jouissance of the.
For example, if we talk about enjoying the rights to work and the rights at work, given the unequal load of the caregiving tasks, the women are overrepresented in precarious informal jobs, and maybe they don't even have the possibilities of investing in the labor networks to advance professionally. Also, the right to education in many areas of the world, in the most extreme case, is that girls are taken out of school due to the caregiving tasks they need to perform. And in the majority of the cases, what's more frequent is that the girls do not have the necessary time to dedicate and invest in their education, given the caregiving tasks they have at home. So, of course, the right to health care, there's a limit to the paid or unpaid labor that a person can carry out. So it is indispensable, and I believe this conference can help us to rescue the 5 R's of the cares that are clear in the caregiving manifesto. Firstly, and with a need and an urgency, we need to acknowledge the social value and economic value of caregiving, be it paid or not, and that the unequal distribution of caregiving work is translated into human right violations, and it is the most important obstacle to the equality of gender. We're not going to end the gender gap if there is not an egalitarian distribution of work. The second R is to recompense or reward. It's necessary to reward remunerated work with same amount of wages, but also pensions, dignifying working conditions, and broad social protection. It is necessary to reduce the unpaid caregiving work, and this reduction comes with investment in infrastructure, in social protection, and in the necessary technology to be able to reduce this load. Redistribute, and this is essential. The caregiving work needs to be redistributed between the family, the state, and the private sector. There is a role where companies must provide the possibility of having uh, childcare centers for the workers, and this needs to be borne, this load borne by them. And also we have to reivindicate the public character of caregiving and reestablish the duty and the responsibility of the state in rendering public services, in developing caregiving systems, in investing, for which it is necessary, and with this I will end, the need of uh, supervision, which is progressive and fair. Overall, the global southern countries are going through a poor macroeconomic situation. They have a very high colonial debt, and at the same time, they've had to invest to be able to solve the social and economic costs of the pandemic. However, there is a way where you can increase the fiscal space to invest in caregiving, which is through taxes to the super rich and to the corporations. We can't advance in the issue of caregiving, we can't advance in the issue of a green justice and an economic justice if there is no higher if there isn't a higher social investment. And we have the means. We're not dreaming. The countries have them available. It is not easy. It requires global coordination. However, we need to change to a progressive fiscal system where everybody pays what's fair. Thank you very much, Magdalena. Rosa, regarding these challenges Magdalena mentioned about the 5 Rs, to reivindicate the public character from the role of the state, effectively, the public services have a role with, to play. From that standpoint, I would like to ask you how the change between public services with gender outlook to change to public services for gender transforming services and from the public sector. Well, this is not easy, and you can't do it immediate from one day to another. You need the political will to try to attempt a change, and it needs the involvement of the workers and the persons who are involved in the process. But I believe that we have to consider one thing before. Public services and the public overall, always in history, have had a role of regulation of the market and of placing an example of establishing more advanced working conditions than in the private sector. This is it. The union history begins with the support of the workers of the public service, which always had better working conditions.
Che la capacità
So the capacity,
di involucrarsi in un processo transformativo
so the transforming movement is very important. We used to call
introducir cambios
so so we have to change in order to have effectively gender equality. I believe the first thing is that we need to defeminize some areas which are fundamentally gender bias, which is the caregiving, the education itself, where once work or the healthcare sector, which had a status in society, today these are sectors or areas that are being attacked because there is a interest in privatizing it, and the attack is moved with the reduction of the salaries and the hurting of working conditions, because these are very, very feminized areas. We need to request a change in the educational system of nurses, puricultures. I don't know how to say this in Spanish, but no, which normally are areas which are female dominated. We need to change that. And once we have more men in those areas, we will have the possibility of winning and change to different working conditions. We have to, and I was saying this, I'm not going to repeat what Magdalena said, but it's true. The idea that caregiving is something that needs all society and that is something that we need to share.
Tenemos un...
We have a small problem with the microphone. Do you have a hand microphone? Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's based on the idea of a different development of our society and of our economy as well. To provide some value means acknowledging the economic importance, not like in the concept of care economy, where the idea is that, yes, it is an important sector because you can make money, you can profit out of it. But since we share the responsibility and we establish a model which is compatible for everybody, socially and economically, and of course, the caregiving work is a green work. It's ecological, sustainable, that can provide a different point of view. The other thing I believe it's necessary to say, since public services can play a transformational role on society, is by assuring services that are able to guarantee the sexual and reproductive rights of women. I believe that this is today the largest challenge we have today, because with the advance of the right and for conservative forces which are regressive and fascistic, is what we see. The decision of the United States on abortion, Roe v. Wade, actually, and my country, where Italy, are our new neo-fascist government. The first thing they did is introduce a ministry of a family and procreation. This says a lot about the need we have to be involved so that we're able to establish or effectively have fundamental rights, like the right to decide about your own body, of women, and their own life as well. And this is something that we need to do, because if we don't, if you're not going to guarantee these rights in society, in the public services, it is going to be a lot more complicated. Change the mentality in those realities in those countries where we continue with taboos, with prejudice, and with a very conservative position about this. Also, I believe that the possibility in the public sectors and in the public services of guaranteeing the same dignity and the same rights to the LGBTQIA community, because particularly in crisis periods, when, as we have seen in the with women are more affected due to the lack of possibilities of accessing public services.
Más o menos es
Um, this is the things I believe we have to do. Of course, the workers and the unions may play a very important role in this direction. And as a matter of fact, we're trying to do this. I want to close with two examples. One is talking about the issue of LGBT plus people. We have a project as an ISP, led by the ISP, where we are organizing our affiliates to commit themselves in a negotiation of the labor rights of these workers, but also trying to unify all the different federations and the union federations in the world to create a critical mass and influence the ILO on the decision of to have an individual standard for protecting workers who belong to the LGBT plus community. Another thing that we're doing in some countries, specifically in Southern Asia, Nepal, India, Pakistan, and in Africa, in other countries in Africa, about organizing women who work as community health workers. I don't know how to say this in Spanish. Yes, community health workers, which have always been considered voluntaries, but with very precise tasks and obligations. So this is why we're organizing, and it's been for me a great satisfaction when, after 3 years of working, we were able to create their first union in Pakistan, formalize the work of 30,000 women with the municipalities of the different regions, and provide them the first collective work contract. And this not only has represented an improvement of their personal condition, but also a different acknowledgement or recognition of the role of these women, transforming their status, their condition in the community in which they live in. Thank you very much, Rosa, General Secretary of the International Public Services. Exactly when you said the example about the recognition in terms of advancing of the rights, Hungary, I wanted to ask you how we value the work of women, and specifically to challenge the sexual division of or gender division of work, and how the public services play a role in this.
Thanks so much for my interpretation. Thanks very much for that question. I'll start by talking about why we need to talk about valuing women's labor. And we need to do that because women's labor across the spectrum is undervalued, and it is often invisibilized and also taken for granted, whether this labor is paid or unpaid, whether it's care work or non-market work. And I would add, when it comes to women's work, that work in the so-called informal economy. And I talk about the informal economy because although the central role of economies is widely acknowledged, it continues to be treated as adjacent. And this is really a policy approach that's prejudiced by the fact that it is largely driven by women's labor. However, African economies, for example, as is the case in much of the majority world, are largely predicated or based on this invisibilized work. And this is really a reality that disrupts this fallacy that the informal economy is marginal, while in reality it is how the majority of households earn their livelihoods. It accounts for 61% of all employment globally, and many of these jobs in the informal sector are care jobs. So it is women's work that sustains households, sustains communities, sustains economies, it sustains life. Not only does it do this, but it often subsidizes the state. So when states fail to deliver public services, health, energy, water, sanitation, care, other social services, and all those services that sustain life, that burden is transferred to women. So women have been described as the biggest reserve army of labor. Also, as you know, have also been described as shock absorbers, especially now in sort of multiple crises. And this is something that I said, as I said earlier, is kind of taken for granted. But our labor not only subsidizes the state, or rather we don't only subsidize the state through our labor, but also through the transfer of costs in the form of out-of-pocket payments and user fees, you know, in the context of privatization of services. And it is the work really of the poorest and most excluded women that is the most undervalued and invisibilized. But also in sort of our northern-centric definitions of work, we see that there are some economic spaces and forms of work that are not taken into account, right, in economic or even in labor definitions. And even in the global south where these spaces are most prominent, states or whoever is counting jobs, right? Whoever is counting the jobs, whoever is kind of counting work, these, you know, you know, whoever is valuing these things also use these sort of neoliberal and inaccurate definitions. So the lenses are clouded by these traditional definitions, right? By this I mean sort of the informal and formal dichotomy, paid versus unpaid, organized versus unorganized. So this has been described as the oppression of vocabulary. So the so-called informal sector, which is the popular sector, is organized. It's just not organized like the factory floor, right? What we may call unorganized is just organized in different ways. I'm saying this because it speaks to the lenses through which we assign value to labor. But anyway, division of labor is gendered, but it's also racialized and it's classed. So you will find that on a general basis, the work done by women of color, who are poor, who are excluded, is often the least valued. And yet again, it's critical life-sustaining work in care services, in domestic work, and so on. As we know, women perform the vast majority of unpaid care and domestic work. This is not news. The time spent on unpaid care work in Africa was already almost 3.5 times more than that of men. The work of women was more than 3.5 times that of men, with evidence of increased unpaid workloads globally due to the pandemic. So for instance, young women in informal urban settlements in Kenya, Ghana, and South Africa, which is where ActionAid has a program working with young women in informal settlements. The young women there reported that they spent 2 to 4 more hours daily on housework as a result of COVID. With the time being distributed between cooking, cleaning, sanitizing the home, caring for sick household members, childcare, and of course education of children, because we know that there was schooling from home at that time. And across the 3 countries, between 60% to 90% of the young women said that their access to basic services had been disrupted during the pandemic, okay, citing transport, health, water, and sanitation as the most severely affected. So this is from a rapid assessment we did in 2020, covering work at domestic level, but there's also the unpaid care work done primarily by women at community level, beyond the household. So including collective community work done in crisis situations, such as those we are now in, right, in multiple and intersecting ways. It also, you know, and this is crucial, includes the work to directly and indirectly support and sustain political activism and mobilization. This too often, you know, remains ignored, is taken for granted, it's undervalued. Even among movements and organizations doing this work, even us here in this room, people need to be fed, they need to be kept connected through different forms of communication, they need to be housed, nursed, attended to in ways. Again, these are roles that are largely done by women, and again, invisibilized or taken for granted. So what does this have to do with public services? One is that a collapse in public services means an increase in women's unpaid care work burdens. I think many of the speakers before me have spoken about this. but it does bear repeating. Again, women's work will subsidize for collapsed public services. So women's care burdens also mean that women are most likely to take up the transfer in costs, as I mentioned, through user fees and so on, to be able to access public services for those in their care and, of course, for their own needs. So some examples, I was going to give two, but I will only give one example of how universal, quality, gender-responsive or transformative public services could play an important redistributive role. And I'll pick the example of transport. So how public transport is designed and delivered has a profound impact on women's unpaid care work, but also their access to decent work and ability to access other rights. So again, this is some of the findings of a study we did a few years ago through our Safe Cities project. Fear of using public transport affects freedom of movement, and lack of mobility impacts access to other essential services, okay, schools, work, social and social public life, and so on. Unreliable, poor quality, and inefficient transport services mean increased time pressure and overall stress for women who have to combine unpaid and paid work. And this influences the kind of paid work that women can take on. So high fares, inefficient routing, so on and so forth, mean that women who generally have lower incomes bear the cost burden as they take children and other people under their care to schools, to hospitals, to do household shopping and so on. But this is not only about the critically vital and paid care and domestic work, but also about paid work. So think about the number of women employed in the public sector. Gender division of labor extends into the public sector, with women making up to sort of 70% of frontline workers in the health and social sector globally. Yet a common feature of austerity measures, including those imposed on governments by the IMF and others, is public sector wage bill cuts. Again, we and our partners have done extensive studies on this, and I'm sure my colleague Rose, who is in the room, will talk to the Care Contradiction, which is a report we released recently on care and austerity. But even in countries where women are well represented in the public sector overall, they are less likely to advance into public administration management and leadership. So they remain, even in the public sector, marginalized by gender division of labor. That means that they're doing the frontline work with fewer protections, less pay, less attention, less value, with the same assumptions about women's readily available and visibilized labor at play. We also know that frontline workers are, also face more violence and harassment in the world at work. This is well documented. One more aspect I would mention as we talk about women's labor is this. We are in the middle of the global 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. And actually today, which is December 2nd, is dedicated to ending modern forms of slavery. When public services fail, particularly in the context of the multiple intersecting crises that we're facing, coupled with debt and austerity, which again has been spoken about, and the liberalization and deregulation that accompanies debt and austerity. When governments cannot deliver public services and wider social protection, women and girls are likely to end up in exploitative and abusive work. So there's a rise in human trafficking, exploitation, and various forms of exploitation of various forms and modern slavery, majorly in the private sector. 86% of all forced labor is imposed by private actors, and women and girls make up about 71% of all of those currently in situations of modern slavery. This is from the latest global report on modern slavery. The point is that there is a continuum of violence related to women's labor, right? So from domestic violence and femicide, often associated with women's care and domestic work roles in the home, to violence and harassment in precarious paid work outside the home. So to close, I would just stress that it's important, while talking about valuing women's labor, to look at all types of labor holistically and in context, valuing all labor and also looking at the potential of gender-transformative public services, to redistribute it and to ensure that it counts as decent work that is fair, safe, and dignified across the spectrum. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Wangari.
Thank you so much, Bondari. You said something about the dilemma that we pose facing the policies of austerity, valuing the different ways to work with the critical perspective of the categories to value the work. So following that line, Ori, I would like to ask you how the measures of austerity and the conditions of the IFE, they are diminishing the public services to promote the gender inequality. How do we face to this dilemma, facing this from a feminine perspective? Microphone, please. Thank you, Camila. Good morning, all. I'm going to speak in English, but I wanted to greet people in Spanish.
The starting point here is to clarify what do we mean by a feminist tax justice or feminist fiscality. And there are some points that my sisters here have already touched upon. So in the first, and these are demands that are reflected in the Bogota Declaration, Tax Justice for Women's Rights, and also in the various campaigns that Global Alliance of Tax Justice has coordinated with our colleagues in the Tax and Gender Working Group, many of whom are represented in this panel in this room. So the starting point for feminist fiscality is really to ensure that tax and fiscal policies recognize, redistribute, reclaim the public nature of care. I won't go into that, as my colleagues have said. There's a point also in ensure that tax policies reduce the unfair tax burden on women, and that there's, of course, the adoption of progressive taxes and redistributive taxes that also work to balance gender inequalities. We need to ensure that tax systems remove the gender bias and discrimination, and ensure that the revenues are raised and spent, that's critical, in ways that promote gender equality. Fourth, we need to ensure that there's adequate financing for gender-responsive social services and public services that, as we have said, and we have the discussion up to now, really go at the heart of where women are and ensure that in meeting women there, we are recognizing the nature of the work that they do in society, and we are ensure that the public services address the specific demands. And lastly, there's the need to establish an inclusive intergovernmental UN body, and I'm here regurgitating language, but the last point is really about the global economic structure and how it continues to work in ways that undermine equality and justice for all. And I wanted to start there because that's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about a conversation that I had just a few days ago when I was walking around Santiago, and I stopped around outside the Museo of Artes Visuales, and I was buying books, and this woman that I was then buying jewelry from asked me what I was doing here because she was very curious about me. I explained about this conference, and she asked me what I would be engaging on, presenting on, and I talked about, I work for the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, and we started a conversation around that. After I gave my elevator speech about what feminist tax justice means, she turned to me and she says, well, as a Mapuche woman, I think tax justice for me would mean not paying taxes. And the reason I say that is because the Chilean government has a historical debt with the pueblos originarios, with the original peoples of this country. And it just doesn't make sense that as a Mapuche woman, as an informal street vendor, I get to the end of the day, and the end of the month, I have to count the pennies, because what I pay in terms of taxes is very far removed from what I can access in terms of services. And that conversation then triggered in me a reflection around what we in the tax justice movement call issues of representation of tax systems. And often, when we are in spaces like this and we are making the connections between tax and public services and tax and women's rights, the tax justice movement walks into the conversation, and I've been saying this throughout this conference, as the rich cousin in the area that says, well, you know, we are going to get the resources through progressive taxation. And that is true, because as my colleagues have said here, we have huge gaps in terms of unfairness in the global and national tax systems, where the richest and the corporations that are really benefiting not only from the pandemic, but from the continuation of the inequalities and injustices, are not paying their fair share. But I think we also have another and a greater challenge, which is, someone yesterday said, how do we make tax sexy for women? That's one way of posing it, but it is a challenge of ensuring that at the level where we meet, we say, okay, we are talking about tax justice, people can see themselves represented in this articulation of tax justice and tax policies. I think the tax justice network in the 5 Rs now have been expanded to include a very critical element that is called reparations. And I think our national, we might seem like this continuation because I work at the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, but at national level, this should be issues that we really need to care in terms of how we conceptualize taxation. Because while we try to construct the idea that taxation is a social good and it's a way of building solidarity, we need to contend with the urgency that people are continuing to be taxed today for benefits that they're going to see maybe, you know, after we address the issues of representation in government. And I think as we think about feminist alternatives in taxation, we have been doing a lot of great work thinking about the alternatives. I'm not sure we've been doing a lot of great work listening to what people have been saying on the ground about our tax policies. And I think the language of austerity, it's very important because, as we know, more than 80% of countries around the world are going into a wave of public cuts, and the introduction of regressive taxation measures is a key point of that. Particularly the introduction of VAT and the aggravation of VAT is now become the public face of what people experience as taxation firsthand, and we need to push against that very hardly because, as we know, we don't have scarcity of money, that has been said. We don't have scarcity of resources. We have unequal structures. We have unequal systems. But I'm more, and today coming and being here and having listened to our colleagues in the education and health and water sector, I'm more interested right now in having a conversation on how can our tax systems then take into account the fact that people need those reparations today. How can our tax policies take into account the fact that we need to build systems in which people can see themselves? And that poses very important questions for us in the tax justice movement around how we think of solutions, how we think of alternatives, what we negotiate or what we advise our partners to negotiate with governments, and also at the international level. We have posters that say, make taxes work for women. And if there's one thing that I think I've learned through this conference is make taxes work for women is not just in pushing back against austerity. It's not just in raising revenue. It's making sure that women's voices, and when I say women, I mean the working women, the Black women, the indigenous women, the women in the movement with disability, LGBTQI women. We make sure that all of those women are seeing taxes as a way to empower them financially and historically, not just in the future, but today. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Aurea.
Thank you very much, Aura. Then we may continue with the same microphone, Liz, where you state this dilemma where how tax and fiscal justice policy is perceived by women. The question is also how public services can drive that point of view, and how, from a feminist focus, could we increase the financing of public services. And this takes us to the discussion of taxing riches, and I would like to speak for you to speak on that.
Yeah. So I think for tax justice, that's as everyone's sort of said already, it's revenue is the key for public services. I wanted to kind of try and complement what Aurea's said by zooming out a little more and thinking about the international kind of architecture and the challenges we have as feminists in tilting our kind of tax justice in a way that I don't think has been grasped as it needs to be grasped. So I think in terms of feminist alternatives to tax justice, as we recognize that revenue is critical, has to be part of that transformative, just, green transition. It's kind of, it's about claiming what is right and necessary for a caring world. And I think the notion of care that others have talked about, and care in the public services and care by the state, is kind of so crucial and has to underpin what we're thinking about, and has to reject that, which has been part of a kind of political discourse for quite a few decades now, is about individualism. We have to reject individualism and reject the non-public or private over public, reject injustice over justice. And so thinking about how revenue is raised sustainably, and thinking about the international position, it has to be done in a manner which is has an intersectional gender analysis across all our actions within the tax justice movement. And so it must confront patriarchy, racism, and the technical aspects of international tax, the kind of tools and approaches we use, quite, most of the time I would say obscure the politics of gender equality. They're not really at there. We're thinking about, we're listening to experts, and the issue of knowledge and where knowledge comes from to inform our thinking about wealth taxes, to inform our thinking about carbon taxes, which is too narrow and has to think about what's carbon just and how that is incorporated into our public services is really key. And that our kind of feminist approach needs to recognize that we need to redress the international financial architecture which governs the domestic choices that are made around tax and governs how we prioritize care and public services, and how that's funded and delivered. So I think a central kind of focus and challenge for us in the tax justice with that kind of feminist decolonial lens is to challenge how knowledge is produced and who we see are the experts, and that we address bias, discrimination, patriarchy that informs our decisions around international tax revenue raising, which connects very deeply to what's happening at a national level for national governments. And we have to kind of, in that knowledge, build and inform how we, from the revenue raising, how we redistribute that and through wealth taxes. And also thinking about what is a just carbon transition, not to, and I think one of the key points that I wanted to raise is that as we go forward and think about alternatives, that we're not replicating the mistakes of the past. And I think there are great risks that we may do that if we're not careful. And there's not enough for us to handpick tax revenue policy reforms without assessing their impact on existing inequalities, on existing injustice, deepen inequalities for women, for indigenous peoples, where for women and indigenous people, their extraction has been violent. So while we're thinking about the options for reform of tax policies and carbon tax justice, we really have to kind of scrutinize their impacts on life and livelihoods for all people. And I wanted to just talk a little bit as well about, some of people during this week will have heard about a really kind of important moment around the possibility of a UN tax convention. The idea of moving the rulemaking around tax away from the OECD and globally north wealthy countries making decisions about the global south that impacts their lives. And this has a real potential to impact revenue raising at a domestic level and a great impact on public services and having those funded properly. But that too, that process and that convention has to also be scrutinized and has to be imbued with the acknowledgement that the taxing rights that face former colonies and the dominance of tax abuse in every country by a small group of wealthy individuals and the largest multinational companies has to be addressed through that intersectional lens, has to be addressed by thinking about the consequences for public services and revenue raising. So in the design and in the coherence and the impact of redistributive tax justice, we have to, I think we have to act in alliance with reparative justice, racial justice, climate justice, for a future alternative. And if I have time, I just wanted to, if I can get it up on my phone, finish with a quote, which is something that we've, bear with me, is something that we've been thinking about, and I mean, many of you will have heard this before, and it's something that I think is very guiding in how we talk about it. Tax justice, very relevant. It is actually a critique about the poverty in white feminism, but it goes, so those of us who stand outside the circle of this society's definition of acceptable women, those of us who have been forged in the crucibles of difference, those of us who are poor, who are lesbians, who are black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. It is learning how to stand alone, unpopular, sometimes reviled, and how to make common cause with those that are other identified as outside the structures in order to define and seek a world in which we can all flourish. It is learning how to take our differences and make them strengths. That's a quote from Audre Lorde that I'm sure many people will have heard, but I think it encapsulates the kind of values that we need to be hanging on to make a transformative change, to make tax justice work for public services.
Muchas gracias, Liz.
Thank you very much, Liz. In this question, how to not replicate the errors of the past, and to address the current crisis, we're going to complement the debate we're having in the stage with some comments from the audience, brief comments. First, Blanca Vallas, researcher on the Depth Observatory in Globalization. Blanca, welcome. Good morning, everybody. I, first of all, want to thank the interventions, the initial interventions, which I believe have been very inspiring and were very strong. And I thank that you haven't decreased the regretful and dramatic situation we are in, the crisscrossing of emergencies, which can be summarized in a social reproductive crisis. And in this, feminisms have a lot of things to say. I also thank that this panel occurred and that today we have workshops to be able to continue going deeper in this. So I believe you've made of some proposals and a diagnosis from a feminism that may be very radical, and I feel happy because I see that feminisms need to go that way. We need a change at the core. This capitalist, heteropatriarchal, and colonialist system does not provide us of our rights. Our companions here have explained how the sexual division is made, but also international or racial division of work. And in this situation, there are collectives that are within the women's collectives, they're in a situation of lower provision, lower access to resources and to rights. And we have this enormous debt from the north to the south, or also the transnational companies from capital from the north to the south. I keep the dimension of extractivism on our jobs. I also want to take what the companions commented. I believe the climatic justice also goes hand in hand with a extractivist dimension on natural resources, and also the ecologist proposal, the proposal of energy sovereignty and food sovereignty, but also reproductive sovereignty, because healthcare, education, care is there. So it's very important also to denounce, and you have done this because the feminisms are already doing this, the defense of resources, and in that sense, the denouncing of extractivism on natural resources and rights. I believe feminisms need to continue defending having access to everything when we talk about energy, water, food, a dignifying home, education, care, and broadening what's public, expanding the public, because we talked a lot about this idea, because also public services and also our companions from the south tell us about the perspective are very different. The point of view in the public services, for example, in the global south, isn't the situation in which it is. And lastly, to have an agenda where the deprivatization is total. We know that the public-private partnerships and the privatizations directly, the TPPs are the same things, or privatizations, do not work. So therefore, the proposal of expanding what's public, also a participating public, we need to talk about public as a community, so we need more participation from the basis. I'm mentioning this from the feminist Catalonian economists, I speak from my reality, and also to have a defense of deprivatization by defending public and communitary, for example, remunicipalization in the sense of the Catalan territory. We also have a demand, a fight from the basis for those remunicipalizations, which comes from the companions of the house caregiving service, the workers, the energy and the water workers, and also the proposal of regularizations. We've talked a lot about global chains which are unfair, so the caregiving chains, but also the global chains in energy, so that the global north has access to energy, there is this colonialist, extractivist dimension, but also we find ourselves in Europe, where about 10% of the population have no access to energy due to poverty. So, regretfully, we have a lot of inequality. Well, once again, I want to thank your intervention, and I wanted to ask you, since we have the climate justice roundtable, how can we ask our companions who are in climate justice, because the defense of the public services is something very ecological. For a planned economy, is very ecological. So, what would you ask them, or what demands would you propose to the companions who come next? So, I hope the debate continues very well today. Thank you. Thank you very much, Blanca. And also remind me that in the last round, I need to ask you how we connect all these fights, specifically for the ecofeminist perspective that Blanca is asking. Umahad from the International of Public Services is going to comment also and ask from the conclusions of the sector meeting of caregiving that has been occurring.
This great discussion. And I wanted to kind of quickly mention about how when we talk about public services, we talk about kind of women's work. You know, it's mostly women who work within public services. They're kind of key and vital to the delivery of these services. And sometimes, you know, maybe not so much in our movement, but outside of it, you know, that can kind of get lost, that element of kind of how key it is to women's work, the delivery of quality public services, and how we can kind of better engage them in kind of talking and engaging in these debates. You know, they're on the front line fighting privatisation. They're usually the ones telling us when things are happening, when, you know, private providers are looking to move in, when governments are looking to kind of expand out and kind of outsource services. They're usually the first ones to kind of blow the whistle. And so I wanted to kind of make sure that we kind of, and I wanted to hear from the panel kind of how we can make sure that workers' voices are included in these discussions, and that we're making sure that, you know, we're not just one group of workers, you know, in one sector, but kind of cross-sectorally across public services, and how we can make sure that their voices are being heard at every level, and that we recognize that the value and the impact of their work.
Muchas gracias, Uma.
Thank you, Uma. Now we will have Carlos Rios, who is Human Rights Watch researcher, and maybe from the sector meetings from yesterday could give an intersectional and independent and autonomous life from public policy. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity of using this space, and we had, in effect, the possibility of keeping with the National Chilean Collective, especially with people with different capacities or disabled, a companion of 49, and they need to live in an elderly home due to lack of care for independent life that is high quality and that keeps into account the will of the people. She was able to attend because she didn't have to be bathed that day. She doesn't determine when she gets a bath. So these are exactly the people who are in charge of the caregiving, who decide when she can bathe, and only happens once a week. And if she misses that opportunity, she can't get a bath in 2 weeks. So the whole system of caregiving and the support needs to acknowledge the possibility of having systems to support the independent life of people with different abilities or disabilities. So to acknowledge the agents that intervene in the caregiving relationship, and it's important to acknowledge that men and women with disabilities provide care as well, and that we need support to be able to do so. Paulina has a 14-year-old boy with which she can't live anymore, and she couldn't support him as a mother. So the 5 R's needs to include the acknowledgement and also the recovery of personal subjectivity and the issue of reducing or redistributing the care, and we reivindicate the right of the women to not provide care and us to have the possibility of having quality support systems which are public and are accessible and of quality. So which means that they need to keep into account the will and the preferences of the people who receive this care. And this includes not only people with disabilities, but also people who are elderly. That the idea that some people need to live in institutions or receive bad quality support in the family environment is a human rights abuse. Well, thank you very much, Carlos. To end this round of comments, and then we return briefly to the panel, Rosa from Actionite.
I just wanted to add a little bit on the role of financial international institutions are playing in this subordination of women through especially austerity policies. Wangari already mentioned the care contradiction, which is highlighting the gendered impacts of public sector wage bill cuts that comes from a study of across 10 countries in ActionAid, where ActionAid is based. And I just wanted to highlight that austerity is reinforcing this notion that women are the shock absorbers. This is not discussed. These policies are made largely without women in the room. Most ministries of finance are men around the world. And this impact of these policies, cutting public sector wage bill, leads to a lack of access to services for women. This means that services that are particularly for women might be cut, or the specific needs to access certain women are cut. Women lose access to decent work. The women colleagues already shared 90% of nurses are women, 70% of healthcare workers are women. So when when there is less public funding for this, the quality of the work and the services really suffers. But also this unpaid care work and time poverty that it creates for women has very harsh impacts. So if we look at some numerical statistics of this, which is not to try and value women's work within that, but just to indicate the scale of this, across just 15 countries, low and middle income countries, ActionAid found that the cuts advised just by the IMF between 2016 and 2020 led to a reduction of $10 billion across these countries, and could have recruited 3 million nurses or teachers in those countries. And this is just in 4 years, and this is before the wave of austerity that we're seeing happening now, accelerating, being pushed by the IMF and others. And just to highlight one country where that's in its 17th program with the IMF, which is Ghana. The health spending has halved from just under 10% to 5%. But at the same time, the government cannot recruit for this 47,000 vacancies that are in the health sector. But there's also 41,000 nurses who have formed an unemployed nurses union because they cannot be recruited because of these imposed restrictions. So my question to the panel is around being able to comment a bit more on the global care chain and this coloniality that reinforces this racialized, gendered discriminations, and how the majority world women are providing the care in global north countries where there is a lack of investment in training and teachers, healthcare workers, and how we can address that. So just to go back to what Radhika said on the first day, how can we make the economy work for women and not women for the economy? Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Ros. Volvemos.
Thank you very much, Rose. We return to the panel. I'm going to ask you to briefly comment and answer the question that is more pressing, and also ask the general question of the panel, which is native feminist character, to face the crisis and promote transforming public services, and how to connect the different variables that we talked about and the fights as well. So Whoever wants to begin. Magdalena, please. I would like to begin with what our friend Rose said, and I believe this is very important. The majority of the developing countries are going in 2023 to take austerity measures, the fiscal or consolidations, and the austerity measures and the cutting in of expenditure in public services can be done because women accept the workload. It couldn't be done. It is done on the shoulders of women, and therefore it is more than ever very important when you see the austerity measures that are being projected for the majority of the countries, that we place the public services charter and the caregiving systems as the center or core to advance. And briefly, I want to touch on what Carlos said. Autonomy is essential. My intervention has tried more about people, has covered more people, caregivers, due to discrimination and the gender roles, who are the majority women. But if we look at the people who receive care, what's essential is autonomy. The situations that are were described by Carlos. These are serious infringement on human rights. These are such strong violations that we can't let them just be done. We can't allow it in societies where determined groups of sectors consider themselves as not capable of making decisions that affect their own life. And lastly, the fight or the struggle is very difficult. We need to begin to gather forces, unite and coordinate. We need a common flag. We need that the feminist movement, the movement for the climate, the diversity, fiscal justice, the human rights movement, the anti-debt movement, work with a common flag. The complexities of the current moment and the interconnected crisis that we live through, which are not interconnected casually, they're interconnected because they are all consequences of an economic structure and a social structure which has been unfair. So we need to face those crises and challenge them with a common flag, because if not, we're not going to be able to achieve anything. And with the climate emergency we're living in, we're talking about the way and the continuation of life as we know it. So I hope that this conference has been an opportunity where the majority of the movements that work in the different sectors, the organizations, the unions, the academia, the activists that we have met here, begin and take the opportunity, and that beginning tomorrow with the result of this meeting and these discussions and the colleagues we met here can gather into a common battle, find that common flag that will allow us to change the way in we consume, the way in which we produce, and with this be able to allow the continuation of life as we know it. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Magdalena. Rosa, any comment? It's still not working, but, well, I believe that we have shared a lot, and in these days we have advanced in the consolidation of an alliance that begun on Tuesday last week, but on Tuesday, and but we have a lot of years of common work in common. If we want to advance in this task, we need to first consolidate our ties and our alliances, assemble the trajectory or the passing of all the experiences to each other, and submit a more organic, strategic, and a program which looks to hit the structural crisis that we have. So I believe that everyone needs to have to be braver in denouncing things, but also in opposing to the decisions that the governments or the institutions at different levels are taking. This is the moment to react. If we are not going to react harshly and strongly in this period, I believe that we're not going to achieve the change we need. Because capitalism has proven the way as the most metamorphic way, more capable of transforming that we've seen in recent history. And we see that its language has changed. It is a lot more attractive. It's sexy. Now with words that seem very good, even for us, and that sometimes people think, okay, well, we can be in this thing, inclusive capitalism and things like that. I believe that we have to raise, take, raise the cover of this hypocrisy and show that no, that the alternative is somewhere else. It is where people are, the citizens are, the workers are, and those who need a deep change, not only for themselves, but for the continuity of life in this planet. Thank you very much, Rosa. Any other comment, please?
I think just to agree really with Magdalena and Rosa, I think we have to kind of value care in and thinking about the question about how it links into other sectors. Thinking about care of what is it, the planet of people, the people who need care and who does the caring, and that governments need to be so much more caring in their policies. And I think we need to be bold in what we're asking for and what we're demanding, certainly in the tax justice movement. And I also think that it's important, going back to this, thinking about this point about revenue, there is funding and revenue for public services. 483 billion per year lost is that we calculate in tax abuse is just the tip of the icebergs. There's so much more there in tax havens that's just allowed to flow around to consolidate wealth, and in consolidating the wealth, influencing the policies. So few people influencing our policies that enact on daily lives and people in care. And I think also we just need to think about the policies that we make are perhaps less about growth and consuming and thinking more about care and consolidating and valuing the people we have doing that care.
Muchas gracias, Liz.
Thank you very much, Liz. To end the talk. Creo que el mío está funcionando, ¿verdad? Qué suerte. Creo que esto es se ha dicho mucho de lo que quería decir, pero quiero responder rápidamente.
And my simple response is that the divide between people and ecology or people and nature is artificial, right? So, and for numerous communities, this is not a new approach to life. It's not a new philosophy, right? So, but it's something that has been stripped away in different ways over the years, through slavery, through colonization, now through neoliberalism, right? So many communities across the majority world were organized around and rooted in communalism, in mutuality, in human and ecological well-being. So for many of us, this is a process of reclaiming and moving away from this artificial divide. So it's really about building from a place of centering care of people, care of the planet, and measuring success not by growth or accumulation and so on, but by human and ecological well-being. So we can't, we can no longer sort of do single, to paraphrase Audre Lorde, we can no longer do single issue advocacy or mobilization because we do not live single issue lives.
Muchas gracias, Aurea.
Muy rápido.
Thank you, Aurea. Very fast, although I don't have anything to mention, but I can say that the future is public. For the public, it's feminist, it's anti-colonial, it's an inclusive future that is managed. It's the future of the people of. So there's nothing more to contribute in the summary. I believe we have an in-depth summary of where we have the opportunity of the crisis of placing the care at the center, and it's the care of an interconnection between the life of the planet and how the responses and the alternatives that we're discussing can be translated in a strategic statement that fills us with bravery and courage for the solutions of this world that we're experiencing. So I want to thank you again on the panelists and for this debate.
Another round of applause
Otro aplauso, por favor, por esa información.
shared that I trust will frame. This will be very important for both the workshops we have this afternoon. Just before we break for coffee, there's one quick announcement. We're going to take a moment to capture this group in a group photo after the coffee break. So we have 10 minutes for coffee, and then we will gather in the space next to the coffee where there are no chairs for a photo that will be taken from the upper area there. So 10 minutes for coffee, then the photo, then we return for the next session. Enjoy the break.